Anderhalf uur staan we zo.
Ja, wil je een
Ik ga
stoel?
even pizza eten.
Ja, tuurlijk. Ik denk dat ik zo ook al een glaasje water. Hallo?
Hey, Sophie.
I can't hear you yet, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, now I hear you. Great.
Cool.
How do you like our setup, Teresa?
Yeah, looks like a lovely room.
Isn't it professional?
Yeah.
We are our game.
I'm loving all the plants as well.
Yeah.
It's great. Where are you?
In Utrecht, at
Oh,
the office of both ends.
I see.
Yeah,
Very nice.
Yeah, it's
What
really nice.
Yeah, nice space. Okay, just give me a shout when you want to start. I mean, you can hear me, so I suppose that was the sound test. So, but if you want to do more sound check, let me know.
I'm not the one doing that, but I think I can hear you, so that's good.
We can hear you fine. Thank you. Oh, heb je er nu weer uitgeraakt?
No, zij heeft zichzelf gemute.
Oh, oké. Oh, Teresa, can you just say a few lines? Oh.
Oh, she's muted.
Okay. Hey, so happy Wednesday.
Thank you. Is it also clear for everyone in the room? Maybe tell us about your location, Teresa. Then you have a few sentences. Where are you based now?
Right now, I'm in Sweden, but right now I'm in Uppsala, which is in the sort of the lower part of Sweden.
Oh, great.
Yeah, as you can
On
see.
vacation?
No, it's no, I'm working here this week. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're tuning a little bit of the voices, but I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Is Daniela going to be there in person then?
Yes, Daniela's already here.
Great.
Grabbing a piece of pizza and then we're gonna start. No, you still have about 10 minutes.
Did you get some pizza, Sophie?
I had forgotten that we had pizza here, so I ate a salad before I came, but then I took a pinch of pizza, of course. But
that's good. Yeah. Good.
No, I really just didn't think of it. But I think a salad is also better for our health than pizza.
Sometimes you need pizza.
Definitely. All right.
Okay, and we're still waiting for Tasneem to join, it looks like.
Yeah.
But we still have a bit of time.
Yeah, I think if we can hear you clearly, I hope we can also hear her. Your connection also seems to be quite okay.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I know you have had the outline. Maybe it's nice to also tell you that I'm going to try to have a dynamic talk with everyone. So I'm going to move from speaker to speaker without necessarily announcing it or having a specific slot for someone. So I might just address a specific question to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. Yep.
Great.
Sounds good. Okay, I'll switch off for now, but I think that's all sounds promising. I think we're set.
Oh. All right. I'll jump to the toilet.
Je hoort ons nog niet? Nee? Good to see you, Tasneem. How are you? Hang on. I think, yeah, now it's fine. He controls whether you're muted or not. So
okay.
You don't need to do that yourself, because if you click, then you mute yourself again.
Good.
Okay. Could you say a couple lines just so we can check if the volume's good in the room?
Yeah, sure. Nice to be here. Nice to see you again.
Very good. Glad to have you. I think everyone is here, so we're just gonna. The volume is good. Tigo, volume's good. We're all good. Okay. We're just gonna sit tight for the last couple minutes, and we're gonna start at 7:30 sharp. All good?
Yep.
Very good. Thank you.
Teresa, I love your background, and it's still so light where you are. It's dark here in Cape Town.
Oké. Nou, ik ga hier even zitten, zodat ik kan ik hier een vraag stellen? 1, 2, hallo. Tik, tik.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our climate talk. Today is our second edition of our climate talks, which are part of 3 climate talks in which we'll enlighten you and hopefully engage you in what we work on in regards to climate. So what are the problems we're looking at, but also what are the solutions? Today is our second part, as I introduced. Last week, we talked about climate change and its relation to gender equality. You can rewatch that if you want to. We'll be recording all these climate talks. And today we'll be talking about avoiding and reducing and addressing climate change. I would like to first introduce a few of our rules for today. It's not going to be a regular webinar. I'm going to try to have a conversation with all of my guests today. And maybe the most relevant and maybe also dynamic aspect of this climate talks is the fact that we have a live audience, but also an online audience. I invite everybody to engage with us, and I will explain to you guys how we can do that. For the people physically here with us, our speaker, of course, whom I will introduce later, but also we have a nice group of Climate Justice Summer School participants who are here to listen to the talks, but also if they have any questions, pose them to our speakers. And of course, we don't just have Daniela Hirsch here who will engage with us in a talk. We also have 2 great speakers online, whom are Teresa Anderson and Tasneem Essop. For your questions, please make sure that if you're online to put them in the chat. I will get them here in a nice tablet, and I will try to pose them to whom you want to direct them to. And if it's to all the speakers, I'll also try to give them the space to do so. Our conversation will be about 90 minutes, so 1.5 hours, and it will be as dynamic as we make it, of course. So feel free to my speakers as well to ask each other questions, but also to add upon each other's perspectives and insights. I think without further ado, I would like to take the moment and introduce our speakers of today. As I said, I have 3 very great speakers. I'm also honored to say that all 3 are phenomenal women, as I would like to call them. So it's going to be a very engaging talk. And I would like to start by introducing my own colleague, of course, Teresa Anderson. She works at our ActionAid International Federation office. She's our senior climate policy advisor, and she coordinates quite a lot of our work on climate and climate justice internationally. She's our go-to person when it's about climate in general, but mainly also very much focused on agriculture and agroecology. She might tell us a little bit more about that later. And maybe also not irrelevant, she's also the one that heads our delegations that engages in the COP negotiations, which we'll be part of as well this year. Thank you and welcome, Teresa. I'll give you a moment to, of course, speak a little bit and introduce yourself and your work a little bit later. Our second speaker, as I said, is also very impressive. I'll try to keep her nice resume very short, but I think she has done a lot of relevant work in the spheres of climate action. Her name is Tasneem Essop. She is now the executive director of CAN International. CAN is International Action Network, which is based all over the world. We also have a department in the EU. She was a former commissioner in the National Planning Commission of South Africa. Before that, she was also part of negotiations in the COP, and she was also one of the people that was part of the delegation through her work at WWF, heading to the negotiations in Paris, of course, which we know of the Paris Agreement. And not to forget, in her country of South Africa, she was also a provincial minister in transport, public works, and property management. And after that, also the provincial minister of environment. planning and economic development. I think in an introduction we had with each other, she also told me a little bit about her history, because I asked, how could you come from a political background to now working for a climate action network? She said, what is important for me is that I seek justice, and in this case, she wants to seek justice through climate action. Our third, but definitely not lead speaker, is Danielle Hirsch. She's here with me today live. And Danielle is also the one hosting us today. Maybe it's good to say that. We're now in the building of the organization which she heads, Both Ends. It's an environmental organization which works with movements and civil society worldwide to generate environmental justice. In her past, I think what I liked when I heard about her biography, she said she studied here, she studied environmental and development economics, and in the books everything looked nice in theory, but when she went to Mexico, she had a reality check that what is in the books is not always reality. And in her professional life, she also worked as an independent consultant with different countries in Chile, Bangladesh, but also international organizations like the World Bank and the UN. Maybe also what we'll talk about today and what is very interesting is the fact that you see that the Netherlands, where we are based right now, is not only part of the problems we caused of climate change, but I think you also see some solutions where the Netherlands can play a very big role. I would like to engage with you a little bit on that later, but I would like to start by giving Tasneem the floor to introduce us a little bit on what she thinks of the topic today. As I said, we're talking about avoiding, reducing, and addressing climate impact. Tasneem, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and let me greet everybody, all the participants in this, and thank ActionAid Netherlands for inviting me to contribute to this important discussion. Wonderful to be sharing a platform with Teresa, and very nice to meet you, Danielle. So this is a very important topic actually right now in the world of climate activism, and especially in the world of negotiations to address the climate crisis, and the framing of avoiding, reducing, addressing climate impacts is very much part of the responsibilities of parties in the negotiations in the UNFCCC. Now, why this is important for me, this particular theme, it's because it's exactly the combination of avoiding, reducing, and addressing climate change that speaks to the relationship between each of these aspects. So when we talk about avoiding climate change, we're really talking about the actions that is needed to reduce emissions, the cause of the climate crisis. And essentially here, we know that the main drivers of these emissions are our dependence on fossil fuels. So that's the one element. Avoiding means reducing emissions, reducing the causes of the harm and the causes of the climate crisis. That's avoiding. But with reducing, that is talking to the issue of adaptation. And I'm not going to get into all of the details of how we deal with adaptation and how to address adaptation, but in fact, it's meant to minimize the impacts of the climate and to address ways of reducing immense harm. But then we come to addressing impacts, and this is where the relationships are all interconnected. If we do not do enough to avoid the crisis, then we end up having to do much more to address the climate crisis in terms of its full impacts. And this is the area where we talk about and refer to addressing losses and damage. This is the area of the climate, addressing the climate crisis, when it has gone beyond our abilities to adapt. And as we're witnessing right now, experiencing right now, there's massive impacts being felt across the world, whether it is the waves, the sequence of the waves of the heat waves that we experience in Asia, moving to Europe, in the north of America. Those heat waves are being felt, whether it's the drought, and the drought particularly in the Horn of Africa, impacting on millions of people, and basically millions facing starvation, whether it's extreme weather events, flooding, hurricanes, typhoons, etc. These are the climate impacts that we need to address, because we did not do enough to avoid the climate crisis. And so the space that we're in right now, so in a sense, this theme is important because it shows the interrelationship between especially avoiding and what we end up with having to address now more and more, the losses and damages due to climate impacts. And where we are in terms of avoiding isn't a very good place. We know that the science, the recent IPCC science has told us that there's not enough being done to address the causes of the climate crisis. And there's not enough done, especially to reduce the harm that the fossil fuel industry is doing as well. And so certainly we also have done an analysis of all the commitments that have been made by national governments, and they don't add up to avoiding the climate crisis as we are supposed to be doing, and especially in terms of the agreements that have been reached between governments to address the climate crisis. So we're in a space now where all the efforts that have been put in place, or the lack of action that is out there with governments, with the polluting industries, with the fossil fuel industry in particular, all of that is not adding up to us avoiding dangerous and chaotic climate change. That's where we are right now. That means, of course, that our efforts must still be pushing for very urgent and much more ambitious actions to avoid the climate crisis. But we have moved into the space of, having to address more and more the issues of reducing harm, of, that through adaptation and the solutions out there to address that. But we are, as the science has also indicated, the recent IPCC science has indicated, we are now in an era of loss and damage, exactly because there's not enough action to reduce the emissions that cause the climate crisis. And so this is a real problem for us in terms of injustice, because we know that the impacts are being felt by those who are least responsible for the climate crisis. We know that the actions that should have been led by rich nations, as I said, is not enough. We know that the fossil fuel industry, instead of this, us seeing an immediate phase out of the use of fossil fuels in a fair and equitable way, in fact, the fossil fuel industry is growing and expanding, and rich nations are now also increasing their investments in fossil fuels, given the war in Ukraine. And so certainly we are not seeing nearly enough efforts to phase out fossil fuel use in the world. And the fossil fuel industry continues making profits and windfall profits during this period of crisis, and will continue to be. We've seen the kinds of figures out there: $3 billion per day in profits, 11 million per day in terms of subsidies that they receive from governments, our public tax money. So certainly the efforts to phase out fossil fuels is not at the levels in which it should be right now. So we're not avoiding the climate crisis, which means that the focus has to be on addressing the impacts of climate crisis and especially loss and damage. And this is one of the big battles that we are fighting as climate activists, to ensure that governments now fund. There's no funding for loss and damage as we speak, no funding at all for loss and damage, and poor nations, vulnerable nations are bearing the immense burdens and costs of the losses and damages that we're already experiencing in the world today, and especially in the global south. So for me, this topic is important exactly because it shows the interrelationship between the mitigation aspects, the avoiding the climate crisis, the way we reduce the harm, adaptation, and then, of course, now in the era of addressing climate impacts, which is pretty much addressing the losses and damages that we already experience. In the end, this is about addressing climate injustice because it's the most vulnerable who are impacted by this climate crisis. So I'll leave it there. I mean, I thought that would be, my take on why this is an important topic to discuss and how they're all connected.
I would like to maybe respond by asking one clarification answer, because I also like to remind all my speakers, of course, I think you're good. You already did a good job of trying to engage us with these terms like loss and damage and adaptation, and I think you gave good examples. But maybe in a specific sense, can you give an example of what country is facing issues around loss and damage, and indeed now that they don't have funding for loss and damage, how it's impacting them or how their future perspective looks like, just to give the loss and damage term a little bit more body. Do you have maybe an example for us?
Let me use the example of, well, there are many examples. There are many examples across the world. Small island states, for example, are suffering immense loss and damage, not just the big extreme weather events that we experience. So, we do read about and we see, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. Or we see massive flooding. These are extreme events. And they, of course, very clearly, that's an example of loss and damage. But it's the slow onset events that we're not seeing in this kind of extreme way. We're not seeing this in the headlines. And that's the issues of, sea level rise, the droughts that we are witnessing as well over time, the impacts of these droughts, especially on food security, etc. As I said, what's happening in the Horn of Africa. But let me give you an example of frequent events that places an immense burden on a global South country. And that is the Philippines. We've just witnessed after the other number of frequent extreme weather events, these massive typhoons that go through the Philippines. They're just about recovering or not even recovered yet, and the next one hits them. And if you put that into perspective of the national context, given that there's no financing for loss and damage, that means that the funding to address recovery has to come out of the national fiscus. And we know that that country, like many developing countries, also have a debt burden. So I do want to put loss and damage in the context of the conditions in poorer, vulnerable, developing countries, especially. They have massive debt burdens. The debt burden is exacerbated because they don't have international funding to recover from these events. And so it just adds to the overall burden. And in the end, who suffers? Again, it's poor, marginalized communities who are suffering and bearing the brunt of this. Because once you have a debt burden, you don't have enough fiscal space to address your social spending, your development spending. And that just is a vicious cycle. Philippines is one of those kinds of countries where I would use as an example, because it's pretty much something that we're witnessing annually and even more than once per annum. So, and the conditions in the country also talk to what is generally the experiences of most global South countries.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very clear example. I would like to move on to Teresa Anderson. As I introduced, of course, she's my colleague at ActionAid, and she's our international policy coordinator. I would like to also highlight that we have produced some interesting writings, including principles of a just transition, not just in the agricultural sector, but also in the extractive sector. Maybe you can enlighten us also why those principles of a just transition might be also relevant to talk about today, also in the climate sense. Go ahead, Teresa. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. First of all, I'll start by saying, you've heard from Tasneem why loss and damage is actually one of the issues that's really central to the issue of climate justice. For ActionAid, we're a federation of 45 countries, offices, most of which are in the global south. And so for, the vast majority of the offices that we work with, climate change impacts, the issue of climate-induced loss and damage is very, very real. And as Tasneem talked about, communities that we're working with are facing all of these extreme weather events, whether they're hurricanes, typhoons, floods, droughts. We've got a lot of responses going on right now in many countries, including the Horn of Africa, Southern Africa, Afghanistan, Haiti, etc. And there've been, so we're always, many times a year we're responding to droughts and floods, but also out of the headlines, as Tasneem discussed. There's a lot of stories. The stories aren't making the news about when the rains come early, when the rains come late, rising sea levels, desertification, and how communities are really having to deal with those challenges. Those, as you probably heard in the last webinar, this climate situation is really disproportionately affecting women more than men. But it's also leaving countries with massive spiraling debts and an inability really to cover the costs of adapting to future impacts or transitioning to greener pathways. And, as Tasneem suggested, outlined, that it's because the UN climate negotiations have agreed that wealthy countries should provide climate finance to countries to help them transition to greener pathways, maybe maybe pick up renewable energy or plant trees. And they are going to give some funds to help some countries adapt to climate impacts. But the UN system currently says that when you have to pick up the pieces and rebuild, help those who've lost everything in the aftermath of a climate disaster, sorry, you are on your own. So it's really shocking that we have a global system that claims to be about addressing climate change, but which actually does nothing to help those most affected. And that is why loss and damage is the central issue that as ActionAid will be campaigning and advocating on around COP27 when it comes up later this year. But loss and damage isn't the only issue facing communities. If we're to do our job as activists, we also need to do everything we can to avoid getting to that point of loss and damage, as Taz outlined, firstly by strengthening resilience and ability to cope with changing weather patterns. So we call that adaptation. And secondly, by reducing the greenhouse gases being added to the planet's atmosphere. So we call that mitigation. And a key part of both of those is by ensuring that wealthy countries provide their fair share of funds for lower income countries to help them make those investments. So we call that climate finance. And when it comes to ActionAid country offices, resilience is really built into much of our program work at local level. The majority of the communities that we work with are rural communities. They're often farmers, usually women farmers, very much on the front lines of the climate crisis. So an adaptation and resilience building at local level in agricultural communities should really put what we call agroecology at the center of their approaches. Agroecology means avoiding using industrial agriculture approaches like, the chemical fertilizers, the chemical pesticides, the purchased hybrid seeds that are produced by these big agribusiness corporations like the Monsanto, the Bayer, the Syngenta. Instead, it's much easier, much cheaper, much more effective, in fact, to use locally available materials like compost and manure and that has a real benefit to adaptation because it ends up actually strengthening the texture of soil. It helps improve the water retention of the soil. And then that means that your crops are much better able to cope with and have improved resilience when there's less rainfall. The water retains in the soil and is still available for a longer growing season. It also means that the soil is better able to absorb the heavy rainfall when there's flooding, and your crops are much more likely to survive. Agroecology also means diversifying your crops. So having local seeds, local varieties that can cope better with different weather patterns and new pests, different temperatures. So that's why agroecology is very much key to an adaptation approach. And we really want to amplify that message because I think a lot of policymakers aren't yet getting that story, but farmers know it, or many farmers know it, but policymakers really need to hear it. And, because we're talking across the various issues, it's also important to say that we as ActionAid are also keen to put the planet on greener pathways, for the safety of our own future, especially that of young people and those to come. And so we really need real and radical system change of our energy systems, our food systems, our transport, our industrial, our economic systems, in fact. And we need that transition to be done in a just and inclusive way. So we talk about just transition because we want to see, the principles of inclusive and participatory processes. We want to see real and radical system change that helps people, nature, and the planet. We want to see the transition addressing and not exacerbating inequality. And lastly, we want to make sure that a transition is just by helping the farmers, the communities that could be affected, could lose out by the transition, to actually get the support, the training, the funding, the social protection they need to make those shifts. So that's what we mean when we talk about just transition, because we know that the market can't just do it on its own. But we also need rich countries, the biggest polluters who've done the most to cause the climate crisis, to make the fastest change and to provide that necessary climate finance. We want to see trillions of dollars worth of public and private funds that are currently flowing into the polluting systems to be diverted, to be divested, and to be shifted towards the real solutions like renewable energy and agroecology. Agriculture is a really big part of that picture, because after fossil fuels, it's the second biggest contributor to global greenhouse gases. And everyone on the planet relies on agriculture to eat, and 1 in 8 people in the planet actually rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. Agroecology is not only a solution for adaptation, however, it's also a solution for mitigation, because it helps farmers to avoid the use of those chemical fertilizers. Producing those chemical fertilizers actually requires a ton of fossil fuels to be burnt, but then you apply them on the soil and many more gases are released, and the soils themselves degrade from carbon into carbon dioxide. So it's a total climate disaster, this industrial agriculture that our farmers have been got hooked on for the last decades. And agroecology really is brilliant. It's really the solution. It's about using local and natural materials to help farmers adapt and protect their crops, their food security, their livelihoods in the face of climate change, while also helping agriculture avoid being damaging to the climate. So agroecology is the future, and both for the global south and the global north. I think I'll stop it there for now.
Thank you very much. I would like to get back to you, not even with my own question, but I see we already have an engaging listener online. She poses a question that is not necessarily on agriculture, but more on the idea that countries in the global south are still using gas during the transition, while we are in the global north pledging to stop using fossil fuels. Many African leaders are saying that they still need fossil fuels, but of course we have seen different, as Tasneem has also said, that the Ukraine crisis is also leading us to use more. But what is your opinion maybe on the fact that African nations or other nations in the global south might not be ready or willing to stop using fossil fuels right now. Teresa, maybe you can react, and then I can give Tasneem as well a moment to react, because she also brought this up in her introduction.
So first of all, I think it's really important to say that actually a lot of the pressure that is taking place right now on African countries to expand their gas resources, to build new pipelines, etc., is actually coming from the EU and from the fossil fuel corporations themselves. You know, it's so distressing how the Ukraine crisis has been really cynically used by the fossil fuel corporations to push open new fronts for expansion of gas into Africa. And the EU is actually very much at the forefront of this. The EU, you know, the various presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, etc., of countries are going, you know, making deals with African countries right now to open up and sell their gas resources. This is being pitched as a transition, which is not a transition, it's a dead end into the fossil fuel, but it's also being pitched as helping Africans with their energy access, which is completely false when you look at it, because these fossil fuel gases are actually going to be exported to the north and are not going to help improve energy access for Africans anyway. And this has all been facilitated by the recent vote, unfortunately, a very tragic vote that happened in the EU Parliament a couple of weeks ago that basically reclassified fossil fuels as green and sustainable, natural gas, fossil gas as green and sustainable. So that was definitely one of the pieces that was cynically designed in order to enable this new pressure on Africa. Of course, some leaders, you know, they may believe the pressure they're under, that this will help Africans get energy access, but possibly there are other factors going on too. But we know that the people of Africa are not going to benefit from that, and what they really, really need is a lot more international climate finance from the rich countries so that they can leapfrog the fossil fuel era and go straight to renewables, because there's so much potential for renewable energy in Africa, and it's also a model that could be better, that would enable distributed control. It will, you know, communities in your own home, even you can produce solar and possibly even wind at community level. It means that the control is much more decentralized. The communities have the power over it. The communities have direct access to it. The fossil fuel companies who get to control entire nations or entire regions' energy access and their dependency on them for their income are very worried about that. So of course they're doing everything they can to push back.
Thank you very much. Tasneem, did you have anything to add on this as well as a reflection shortly?
Yes, no, I absolutely want to just support Teresa's point about this rush for gas right now being driven by, in fact, global north countries, not just the EU, but the US as well. So certainly, you know, and they have used the war in Ukraine, the kind of energy security problems as a way of continuing that rush. In Africa, we essentially, as climate activists, we are calling this the next wave of colonialism. They again doing this extractive approach of the resources in Africa, extracting it. It's mainly going to be exported. It certainly won't address the issue of energy access in Africa, and especially again by those communities who need it the most. So yes, there are governments in Africa who have also stepped into this breach where gas is considered a transition fuel, and that's misguided, completely misguided. But if we looked at the overall picture globally, and if we had understood the issue of fairness and equity and an equitable approach to addressing the climate crisis, and this common but differentiated. So in other words, with the principle of differentiated responsibilities, recognizing that the historic polluters, the global north, had to take much more drastic action to reduce emissions if there was a fair and equitable system in place, and if there was the kind of time frame and the remaining carbon space that would allow especially developing countries and especially Africa to have a bit more time so that they could also sort out their own development needs, not necessarily, now with the time frames being cut short, the carbon space not being there, they obviously have to leapfrog towards renewables far more quicker, at a higher cost, of course, completely. But if things were fair and equitable, there would have been the opportunity for developing countries to do a transition that was far more planned, far less disruptive potentially, and the possibility to ensure that there was going to be justice in these transitions. But that's not the case, because when you look at the studies that show who's actually taken up most of the remaining carbon space, the budget, sometimes it's called, it's been rich nations. And within that, even a smaller percentage of very, very wealthy people, the elites of our society who have used up the carbon space. So there's another added injustice, that dimension of injustice between countries, injustice within countries is something that we have to be very clear about. But, just to answer the question, this kind of rush for gas right now is pretty much global north driven, entirely.
We'll switch to the global north, where we are in the Netherlands with Danielle Hirsch, of course, next to me. I would like to also give you the floor. What is most interesting to me also in the work that both ends does is the fact that we try to address the Netherlands as part of this global north and the responsibilities it has in not just addressing, but also being one of the causers of these issues that we're facing right now. Maybe you can share with us some of your reflections on the work you have been doing, but also how you see the Netherlands' position maybe in this avoiding addressing the climate change situation that we're in right now.
Thank you. I'm going to try. There are so many things going on in my head that I will find it difficult to talk for 5 minutes, but you'll stop me. So first of all, I think it's very important. I don't know how many people online or in the room are from the Netherlands, but it is very important to realize that the Netherlands has a very polluting economy. So our footprint, if you compare to other European countries, so not only European member states, but also non-member states that, non-members of the European Union, our footprint is the biggest of all. And there is a very clear cause for that, and that consists in the fact that we are a big trading nation. We're the second largest trader in agriculture goods, and we're basically a fossil fuel economy. And that is caused by, for example, that the fact that we have Rotterdam as one of the biggest fossil fuel ports in the world and the biggest in Europe. And one of the reasons so many ships come to Rotterdam also with agriculture goods is that Rotterdam really sells cheap and very bad fossil fuels to the shipping companies. It's also, of course, caused by the fact that around Rotterdam, there has been developing what we call a maritime sector. And that's basically the people that build ports all over the world. So they dredge, they build pipelines, they build offshore and onshore exploration, whatever, fossil fuel treatment factories, etc. So because we're a main port, we're a big trading nation, and we are an agriculture power, not so much because of what we produce, but what we trade in, our footprint is huge. And that doesn't just come about. That came about because our government has been supporting all our governments, not only the liberal government or whatever. Also, the Social Democrats have always supported these main port developments, including Schiphol, including the port of Rotterdam. Now it's all a discussion about big data centers, which also consume a lot of energy. So our policy has always been to be a hub in large-scale trade relations. We have been always fighting for really liberal trade agreements, which also don't allow for countries to build up their own industries, etc., etc. So we're, as far as we can see it, we're a big part of the current problem. And that goes way beyond what we do or not do at the COP. It's just what we do each and every day with our public funds, with our private companies, etc. So, for example, what we do with our tax money is that we subsidize fossil fuels with 17.5 billion euros a year, which is way more than goes to whatever, you know, to a development corporation, to education, whatever. It's a lot of money. So if you are, of course, I can go on and on about what's so bad about the Netherlands, but we can also go like, okay, if we're part of the problem and if we have an urgent problem to solve, we should also be able to be part of the solution. So today we can start doing things that actually will make a difference because we're in the middle of this chain of trade and pollution, etc. So a couple of the things that, do I have to stop? Oh, no, okay. A couple of the things that we've been working on, and it's been mentioned already. First of all, divestment. Divestment not only by the public sector, so get your subsidies out of fossil fuels. And we've been looking in particular to the subsidies or the financial support that our state gives to the exports by the maritime sector, so the development of all these fossil fuel related ports and pipelines and infrastructure, but also divestment by the private sector, the banks, etc., that needs to go out of fossil fuels. Because if there's one thing that is clear, apart from the need that we have to adapt and that we have to compensate for loss and damage, it is that we have to mitigate. We have to stop emitting climate pollution. So divest any money that we have into fossil fuels. So we look at the banks, we look at the pension funds, and the pension funds in the Netherlands are very interesting because they are amongst the biggest of the world. So we have a total 1.5 trillion, I think, whatever, a lot of zeros, a trillion in our pension funds, and the biggest has already said that they will take their money out of fossil fuels, and that has actually made a big impact. So it shows, because what is the impact? Not because they took out 16 million or whatever a year out of fossil fuels, no, because they show that a big financial institution can go out of fossil fuels and still assure rendement, that their pension holders get the pensions that they have been promised. So that's one. The other one is that we have, so I always call it capital, knowledge, and networks. We have all three. Despite the fact that the Netherlands pushes for a totally unsustainable agricultural model in the world, actually there is a lot of knowledge, both in knowledge as well as experience in the Netherlands and by people, Dutch people outside of the Netherlands, that actually implement all the principles of agroecology, which doesn't, I just want to stress this, part of it is how you do it in terms of technology, low tech or not, how you use the soil, etc. But it's also the way you organize around production. So there's a very, very strong social part to the agroecology agenda. And that is exactly the part that we should be looking at way more, because if one thing's clear in agroecology, and especially now with the food crisis, is that we have to shift power from the large-scale agro-industrial countries and companies to people actually producing food, which is not the people that are at the table right now. So we have that knowledge, we have that experience, and I think we should be doing way more with that, both in the interest of many, many others in the world, but also in our own interest, because we have a huge agricultural crisis in the Netherlands at the moment. We won't go into that, but just so you know. Maybe I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there for no time.
Yeah, I think that is I think you have reflected a little bit on it as well, but one very specific and concrete question about our position in the Netherlands. So I like the fact that you're also forward-looking in how we can address with all these means and capabilities we already have in the Netherlands, or in the knowledge and experience we have, but also a person watching is addressing this hypocrisy that we have, where on one side the Netherlands is saying, okay, let's stop, we have to address climate change, but then on the other side, of course, we know we have the knowledge to, and we can possibly as well invest in new knowledge development that could help us address climate change, but we're not doing that. And how do you overcome this, the Netherlands saying one thing, and then sometimes it's even when we're in conversations with policymakers, we're too small as a country. I don't think it's us that need to be the change. We have to do it together, and then that's where their action stops. So how would you feel we could address that? Would that be something to talk about at the COP, or?
I think, and I wonder what the others think, but I think that it's clear by now that everybody has to start doing right now what he or she can do. So we talk a lot about what consumers can do. You know, we have to fly less, eat less meat, da-di-da-di-da. But any government needs to start doing what any bank needs to start doing now, because we simply don't have time anymore to stop and wait for others to start moving. And while at the same time, and we have to be honest also to those policymakers, that it is the same people that say we have to wait for others that have been causing the fact that others have not been doing stuff. So as long as we promote our fossil fuel industry to many, many countries, not only developing countries, with a lot of public funding and a lot of public time and energy, it isn't that weird that others go with the flow. It is, we push for something and others don't really have, well, they have a choice, but they don't have an easy choice. So we have chosen to push for a certain model, and it's us that has to change that model. And we don't have time to wait for others. And I think increasingly, in the Netherlands, coalitions, and I think globally as well, and that is something that is difficult for climate activists, to form coalitions with others that ask for the same change. And I think there is where we have homework to do, and that is our day-to-day work, to start thinking, okay, what do we do differently? Because we have been saying this forever, so that didn't work either, let's be fair. So what is it that we need to change?
Yeah, thank you. Tesnien, would you be able to put it as well in the global context, as you have experience in the CAN network, while looking at other countries as well? Because I know we have developments where countries like China and India are also pointed at this moment, and they're saying, oh, well, if they don't start now because they are going towards being the biggest polluters, then we can't do anything in Europe. How would your reflection be on this? Who's going to do what and when, and how big are the responsibilities?
Well, yeah, no, thanks. I think it's really important, again, to reflect back to what I've been saying about a fair and equitable approach. So if all things were fair and equitable, then there are going to be, you know, there would be a situation where an India, for example, who has come under massive attack. I remember in Glasgow COP, when India was putting forward the language about phasing down fossil fuels, they came under huge attack by climate activists. But we don't recognize the fact that India historically is not the cause of the problem. They will contribute to the problem now, they will contribute to the problem in the future, but historically they haven't been responsible for the climate crisis and would need to have the time to transition away from fossil fuels and take care of their own development needs. The problem is there's no fairness and no equity in the global governance system and the way actions have been agreed to and commitments made. So that's pretty unfortunate. But our global South countries, and here we should be as climate activists in the global South, we should be pushing our governments to stop following the kind of the very kind of economic models, the systems that have been driven and led by the global North capitalism, neoliberalism, that has caused this crisis in the first place, our governments in the global south tend to think that's that is the answer and that is the solution, following the same models. We have an opportunity in global south countries to, in fact, move onto a path of different development models, different development systems, and particularly in Africa. In Africa, in African countries, we really have to push our governments to move away from following this kind of neoliberal model of economic development. It has not resulted in any change for the masses of people who remain poor, who do not have access to energy, who will, massive unemployment rates, etc., etc. So certainly the existing models of economic development does not work. It's caused the climate crisis as well. And so we have to shift to alternative models. And that's the challenge for Global South leaders. We need to put pressure on them to understand that they can become leaders in alternative models of alternative systems that, Teresa and Danielle have spoken about, that looks at agroecology, that looks at renewable energy as solutions, that looks at more decentralized, community-based, community-owned systems to produce and generate energy, for example. One of the questions in the chat is about from Brazil, where they have, and it's not just Brazil, in many of these projects, they have highly concentrated, centralized renewable energy systems. We know in many parts of the world, there are examples where there are decentralized systems and ownership of those systems are in the hands of communities. So I think there are enough ideas and examples of wonderful solutions that take a very different approach to highly centralized, profit-oriented models of development. And so, yeah, I think the challenge for the Global South, for the Indias, the Chinas, and even for, middle-income countries, least developing countries, get out of the existing models of economic development and shift towards alternative models, alternative systems that put people at the center. And that's immensely doable with the solutions that Teresa, Danielle have already spoken about. That's out there, but it's not scaled up and it's not valued.
Thank you very much. Teresa, maybe I would like to go back to you and also reflect a little bit, not just on the question about Brazil, but also that social aspect that Daniela touched upon a little bit, where agroecology would not just be a method of being sustainable, but also has some social aspects to it. And maybe you can give us a certain example, whether it's in the energy field or in the agricultural field, where you see that the transition is really happening in a just way, where not just the social and environmentally people are respected, but it also empowers people as such to be part of that solution.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll start with just also talking about how women. I think you've already covered that women are most impacted by climate change. And that means that they are many times more at risk of death and displacement during disasters. And there are cultural norms that mean that, because of childcare responsibilities, fetching water, fetching firewood, etc., as well as policies that are gender blind or gender biased, women are just many times over put at a disadvantage and are much more vulnerable and much more likely to suffer from the impacts of climate change. Also, their voices are not listened to often, they're not seen as the experts. And so we need to make sure that when we talk about climate solutions at community level, to address the real impacts of climate change, we really need to listen to those that are most impacted, not just the views of the wealthy elites who have access to politicians. So I just want to start with that before diving deeper into your question, Sophie, because it does all come together. Because women, ActionAid, we've been working with communities all over the world to put agroecology at the center of our activities, our resilience and adaptation activities. But the social impact has absolutely been very key. One of the social dimensions we've made at the core of this is about women's empowerment. So by combining participatory processes with community members, with their pathway to feel more confident, to speak out, our programs tend to work to help women to do the analysis, to reflect, to discuss how climate change has affected them over the years, how it's affected their communities, and whether there are aspects that increase their vulnerability that can be changed, what they can do about it. And they come to the conclusion that agroecology is an approach that really works for them. It's always been very well suited to the needs of low-income women because they don't need to buy the chemical fertilizers, the pesticides, the seeds, the machinery. For women farmers who don't usually have deep pockets or loads of cash, this is a really important solution. But it's also a really empowering solution. It really turns the whole economic model on its head because everybody has the solutions on their doorsteps, in the fields, in the forests outside. It means they are not dependent on that one big rich corporation, that global corporation that is selling that same seed product to farmers all over the world. You can see the same seeds and the same chemicals in shelves in every single country around the world. And that money is going into a few very, very, very wealthy hands. Instead, we have this very challenging model of agroecology that really puts the power and the control back in the hands of farmers. And for thousands of years, across continents, across generations, women have actually been the guardians of local seed diversity. Women's cultural practices are often very much embedded in many cultures around the world, that they're there to ensure the protection, the sharing of seed diversity, the exchange of complex knowledge relating to seeds and agriculture. These are often very much embedded in indigenous and cultural practices around the world, from Asia to Africa to Latin America, less so that I know of in Europe, but possibly it was there, many hundreds of years ago as well. And so really we see the value of programs that take account of both the climate benefits, the biodiversity benefits, but really the social benefits and the very radical social challenge that agroecology poses to the economic system.
Thank you very much. Maybe back to the guest at the table here with me. I saw you scrabbling quite a few things when not just Teresa, but also Tasneem was reflecting on the question I posed. I would like to give you the floor if you have.
No, it's just, I think it's all been said. I think one of the things that we have to realize, and honestly, I think it's probably also in the global north, if you think who leads the climate movement at this moment. I think it's women that are leading the whole movement around climate change, both in terms of solutions as in terms of the more political economy, the struggle around it. So I think it's time that it's not for nothing that there's 4 women. The whole room is filled with women, except for the guys that sit behind yay, technology. But I think we have to start owning the fact that we're leading this movement. And it's not, and it's probably because we also are, or women are, the victims of what's happening more than men. It's also because women are fed up with the whole system that has brought us to this stance, which is go way beyond climate change, by the way. So I think the feminist movement, the climate movement, they all have very strong similarities. And when we work, we work in a program that brings together the climate movement and the feminist movement. And the essence of what makes women climate leaders is that they have the economic security, which often is built by agroecological practices, to then only then can they go out to be a political actor, etc. So they have to assure a basis of like livelihoods in order to pick up their role as a political actor. And we oftentimes forget that. You cannot just go out and be a politician in many instances. So I just want to make sure that we own the fact that women are leading the climate movement in many aspects.
Thank you.
That's what I wrote down.
That is, I think that is a very good reflection that maybe not most of us stand by or dare to also say out loud. I know as ActionAid we call ourselves a feminist organization, and also in the dynamics of not just talking about climate change, but also challenging the systems that need to change because they're just not working for women and marginalized people. I think it's very good also in the climate spheres to talk about the fact that feminist solutions are the key, basically, that are gonna help us not die of what is happening.
Add something?
Of course.
I just want to say that it's feminist solutions, but it's also the feminist movement has certain processes in place that normally, like at least the environmental movement where I come from, or the more traditional climate spaces, don't have in place. So they're not inclusive, they're not transparent, they do not respect other than scientific knowledge, So I think we can learn from the feminist movement also a lot in terms of process and not only in terms of doing stuff.
I would like to come back to maybe Tasneem also, because I'm thinking in terms of, as a federation within ActionAid, we try to work and build on solidarity and also come together, not just as organization in the global north, but also try to go hand in hand with what is happening in the global south. I'm also wondering in how that manifests on a global level. So do we see that when we're talking about feminism and that we need the solutions and actions and processes in which we work to be feminist, does that resonate only with women that are in the global north? Is that the same with activists and leaders in the global south? And how are these dynamics? I was wondering whether Tasneem can reflect, and maybe you as well a little bit later.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, in fact, there's a really wonderful global, women and gender constituency, right? And through the women and gender constituency across the world, in the global south, in the global north, there's been massive amounts of work and effort put into the development of radical feminist alternatives, radical feminist solutions, etc. So I don't think, I mean, of course, we can debate about different understanding and practice of feminism, but certainly the idea of whether you call it feminist movements or whether you call this women's movements, and especially grassroots women's movements, Danielle is right. I mean, women are actually at the center of finding the solutions, trying to address the climate crisis, build resilience, etc. And as Teresa also says, while at the same time also being at the center of bearing the worst impacts of climate change. So here we have women at the center of all of this. And of course, the leadership will have to come from women. Our solutions would have to be women-centered. And especially, let us not forget to add the class dimension here. Yeah, you know, women in the global north who are have a decent income, you know, the countries have good social welfare systems, etc., will not have the same ability, you know, to be resilient as a poor working class woman or a smallholder farmer in a global south country. So we have to recognize that diversity as well, and that difference of experience and the ability and the capability to build resilience, be resilient in the face of the climate crisis. But women will have to lead. We have to have, you know, feminist solutions. And when we talk about developing alternative systems, it would have to be, you know, firstly, those alternative systems will be built by women. So it's not a global north phenomenon, Sophie. You know, there are massively exciting women's movements, feminist movements across the world. As an international network, you know, we have really a very broad range of members that includes ActionAid. By the way, we're very proud of ActionAid as a member of CAN. You know, what we've been doing more and more is to ensure that the voices, especially of Global South organizations, are being far more represented. Again, you know, the kinds of transformations that we are expecting our governments to take is something that we as civil society also have to reflect. We often mirror the unfortunate injustices, inequities that exist in the world within our civil society movements as well. And I think this is another area of work that we need to look at and ensure that as climate activists, as you know, being part of a climate movement, we also have to look at those kinds of practices that cause harm, that's unjust within the way we do our work as well. And here again, feminists have the ability to lead us in those kinds of transformative, as Danielle said, transformative practices, transformative solutions that we require, and we see that in our movements as well. So certainly, Sophie, just to come back to your question, I went on a long trip here. Yes, of course, the feminist movements, the women's movements, very strong in the Global South as well.
Great. Thank you very much. I was about to remind everybody to please pose the questions to our speakers, if you have any that's online, but also here in the physical space. And I have a volunteer here that would like to pose a question. So I would gladly give you the floor. Please let us know who you want to ask the question to.
I don't have necessarily a specific person I'd like to ask the question to, but on my walk here, going through the station, I see a lot of ads for Just Dig It. And I was curious as to what your impressions are of these kinds of initiatives that are aimed at either helping adaptation by planting extra trees or offsetting carbon and carbon emissions and those kinds of issues. And I mean, sometimes I feel like they do some good, sometimes I feel like they do a lot of bad, and I'm curious as to where you guys kind of land on that.
Thank you very much. Let me start with Daniela, because she was shaking her head very, very obviously next to me. So I think you have a reflection, and then I'll come back to you, Teresa, because I think you also have some reflections on that.
So I just want to bridge what I was said right now. Just Dig It is a really good marketing campaign. It says, you know, you have to plant trees in a certain way and then it'll just grow. And it's proven not to work. And the guys that are behind it know that it doesn't work. But it's a really good marketing campaign. So it's for me an example of one of those things where we haven't shifted power yet, because there are huge networks of farmers in the Sahel that have proven that you can regreen the desert if you do certain, you know, practices of regeneration, etc. That's not what Just Dig It does. So I just wanted to say it's an example of one of those not so shifting powers that appeals to a large audience, in this case in the Netherlands, and has a great success with that, in spite of the fact that we know it doesn't work. So, and I leave the rest.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add a question, if Teresa can reflect on this as well, is how do we combat such things? Because I think this is just an example of what we also call false solutions, which are proven not to work, which we can out loudly say it really doesn't work. It's proven it doesn't work, but still it's mobilizing people, it's mobilizing financing to be able to be done. So maybe Teresa can reflect and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting to hear about this Dutch example of Just Dig It, which I hadn't heard about, but I'm not surprised to hear your conclusions, Danielle. I mean, yes, trees are a good thing. We're not going to say that there's no point in planting trees, because ecosystems are a key part of what we need to do to cool the planet to well, some part of what we need to do to cool the planet. In fact, one of the reasons why the planet is warming up so much is that we have devastated so much of the planet's ecosystems that they have no more capacity to absorb the emissions that we keep pumping into the air. So it's very easy and very convenient for us all to feel empowered by planting a tree. And, you know, if that creates the impression that we've planted a tree and that we've solved the problem, then that's bad, because it's stopping you take the other real radical action that you need to take. But there are other even more cynical ways that the idea of tree planting, even the idea of ecosystems, is being abused and manipulated by the very biggest polluters themselves. Dutch and British company Royal Dutch Shell themselves are like now selling themselves as, you know, we know they're the biggest polluters on the planet, right? But you see their adverts and they're pretty much saying, buy our fossil fuels and save the planet. And how have their fossil fuels suddenly become the solution to the climate crisis? It's because they claim that they will be planting trees in order to offset the emissions associated with the operations and sometimes the burning of the fossil fuels. And it's deeply cynical because because we know that though, you know, they need so much land in order to offset, for a start, they need so much land that they're going to be driving land grabs. There'll probably be very harmful tree plantations. They will displace communities from farmland in order to make space for new tree plantations. We calculated that Shell's announced this net zero by 2050 target. It may sound good, but it sounds a bit like they've committed to zero emissions, but net zero is not zero. Net zero is saying we can continue polluting as much as we like, as long as we do something else over here that might possibly, you know, suck and count negative and compensate for the emissions that we're releasing. And they just declare this target. They don't really do anything to get on that target even, but it makes them sound good. It makes them sound green. But if they continue those emissions rather than bringing their actual emissions down, that means they need massive amounts of land for tree plantations. And there is not enough land on the planet to offset all the emissions planned by Shell, let alone all the fossil fuel companies, let alone every single corporation and government on the planet that is now announcing net zero targets, but doing nothing to bring their emissions down to real zero. So we calculated that Shell alone, on their pathway to net zero 2050, would still require land 3 times the size of the Netherlands by 2030. But they're not planning, of course, to displace all of you in Amsterdam and Utrecht and push your homes aside and plant new trees. No, they're planning to do that in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Of course, the communities that are already on the front lines of the climate crisis, that have done the least to cause the problem, they're the ones that are going to be harmed yet again by these false solutions to climate change. Rather than, so we need to be pushing we need to be debunking this greenwash because it does harm and it allows the polluters to continue business as usual. So that's why we've been putting a lot of effort into debunking this net zero push, the carbon offsetting greenwash, and really trying to push a conversation forward on what would it look like, what would it take to bring emissions down to real zero in a just transition way. And that really still needs a lot of, those conversations are getting increasingly radical by the day, but they're not yet at the center of policy. They're not even at the center of civil society demands yet. So there's still a lot of work to do to really get us on the pathway we need to be stopping this climate crisis.
Thank you very much. Would you like to reflect on that a little bit? Otherwise, I'll come back to
my reflection to the question was, and I think it's been said in a way, there is no only technical solution. So the whole issue of making the system change requires, and that's why I come back to the women's movement or the feminist movement or whatever, we have to do things in a different way. So if we keep on with the logic that we have been coming here, whatever topic we try to breach, it's not only about climate change, it just isn't going to solve anything. So the moment that people give you something and it sounds so logical because you recognize it because it's been told to you forever, there has to be like, it hasn't worked until now, so why would it work now? And that's because the social part isn't involved. The power relations part isn't involved.
Thank you. I would like to go to a few last questions that I would like to put on the table before we go to the closing remarks. What we celebrated as a win at Action Aid the Netherlands is the fact that last year at COP, nations, of course, including the Netherlands, you're already nodding while I haven't even finished my question, so I think you know what I mean. They pledged to stop financing fossil fuels. I was very curious whether there are any results yet. Is there any movement already?
So just I just talked about this export, our government supporting the export of this fossil fuel industry, which I defined as the maritime sector, like the Rotterdam sort of cluster. So it's not, there were 34 countries that signed a paper, the Glasgow Statement, and the Glasgow Statement said that they would stop supporting the export of fossil fuels and fossil fuel activities by January 2023, so sort of tomorrow. It all went very well, also in our conversations with the Ministry of Finance, who is responsible for this instrument, until the Ukraine war, which is now being, as others have said, being totally abused to get back to this narrative of we need to get fossil fuels wherever we can get it because that will solve our problems, totally denying, as far as I'm concerned, the fact that we're going to governments and government leadership, or not even governments, I mean, people that are leading very, very repressive regimes because we want to get out of our relation with Russia. We're going to Azerbaijan and we're going, I don't know where we're going. So we're going to Venezuela, etc. So we are going, the fossil fuel addiction, the fossil fuel reflex, whatever you want to call it, is now causing that we don't have a no yet. But the exception for gas, because it's so important for local development, you know, everything that we've been heard is now being thrown at us again. Interesting to say that there are ministers that still want to keep their promise. So we haven't lost yet. You can sign the petition to ask our government to please go ahead with their commitment. And it's very interesting, at least maybe I am naive, but so we're sitting now at the table. It's only 2 companies that don't want this, only 2 companies. And they are getting what they want. It's impressive to see the kind of power that these kinds of companies have. So the fight's still on, but we are not extremely hopeful. Maybe somebody can.
Is there any more hope at Tasneem in terms of looking at fossil fuels and divesting from it? Not just maybe in the context of the countries that signed that declaration, but in general. And maybe I'd like to also add another question on that came from the audience, which actually says it seems as if renewable energy, even though we might want that for some of the countries as well that are opting to still use fossil fuels, that it seems to be expensive and unattainable, which causes them yet again to stay with fossil fuel. Is that an accurate reflection, or do you see that differently, as well as, of course, the context we're in where they're saying we do still need gas and it's a natural product?
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Let me deal with this last question first, right? The idea that the renewable energy is still expensive, it's not affordable, etc. In fact, that's not the case. Now, the pricing and the affordability of renewables is actually much better. If you think about the so-called cheaper costs of coal, we know for a fact that price does not reflect all the externalities, as it's called. The real price of fossil fuels is not reflected, but certainly there are enough. And if you read, for example, the International Energy Agency's reports, etc., renewable energy reports, you will see that in fact the cost of renewable energy is coming down. It is becoming far more affordable. What is the problem in many poorer developing countries is that they do not have the finance to be able to leapfrog away from fossil fuels into renewables at the scale that is needed. And that's why the issue of climate finance is such an important issue, and that we need to fight for. You know, we can move to renewable energy. The International Energy Agency has put forward, you know, the pathways to do that, but it does always conclude that it needs massive scaled up financing. So if you think about it, you know, all of us taxpayers, and Danielle just spoke about what you're paying for the fossil fuel industry by way of subsidies in the Netherlands. Across the world, we're talking about billions or trillions maybe of subsidies that go to a fossil fuel industry that's the cause of this crisis in the first place. That's unethical and immoral and shouldn't be allowed. If we shifted those subsidies towards renewable energy and climate finance for renewable energy, then it becomes affordable. It becomes immensely doable. So I think whenever we listen to or we hear the arguments that generally gets used, like this one, oh no, it's too expensive. You know, the fossil fuel industry probably has a hand in those kind of arguments. Go look at the evidence, go look at the facts. And then when we talk about finance, let's just interrogate where money is going to in the world today. And it's going towards all the bad things, the harmful things, whether it's the fossil fuel industry, whether it is the war machine that gets funded. There's enough money to address all of those harmful things, but we don't have the political will with our leaders to shift the money to actually do the good things. So we must be very honest in our reflection of what is being done with our money in the world, and it would then, you know, be able to address the crisis if the money was actually directed in the right place. So I'll respond to that that question in that way. And then Sophie, the first question, sorry, now that I've gone on to
was about how true it is that when you pledge to exit fossil financing, how that is manifesting and what experiences you have in that, as Daniela was reflecting on the fact that, of course, this crisis has caused some nations maybe to revisit their position in the pledge they did in Glasgow. Okay.
So now I'm going to confess that I am immensely cynical about all these pledges and these so-called commitments that governments have made, and especially in Glasgow, you know, I mean, we had all these amazing announcements by, in fact, as Teresa says, even the fossil fuel industry made these net zero, and I'm immensely cynical about all of that. Firstly, I think we need to interrogate the integrity of those kinds of pledges, whether they all add up, whether they're real, whether, you know, pledges for finance, for example, no, I'm sorry. You know, rich nations made a commitment more than 10 years ago in Copenhagen to deliver 100 billion per annum. And when we talk about trillions being spent on the fossil fuel industry, didn't deliver. So, you know, commitments and pledges are easily rolled back. And the only way we're going to address this is if we use our power, to push these governments, to hold them accountable to the commitments that they've made, because they're not going to do it on their own. To be quite honest, most commitments are rolled back. Governments committed to have aim for 1.5. They didn't do it. They committed to provide finance. They didn't do it. They're committing to all kinds of things that they just easily roll back. So at the end, and maybe this is my concluding remark, Sophie, we have to use our power. We have to build our power, and we have to use our power nationally, locally, globally, and we have to push our governments now because, look, we don't have time. and millions and millions and millions of people are suffering from multiple crises at the moment, and we don't have time to waste. We don't have time to, figure out what we need to be fighting. This is a struggle, and it is a struggle for survival.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. I like the energy and the conviction you have when talking about how unpromising these pledges are that promise us a lot of things, but then in reality they don't realize them. I would like to go to concluding remarks, because I know we can sit here for another hour or two discussing this very interesting topic. I think we have had quite some good reflections, but I would also like to come back to the initial question of this session, of course, how to avoid, how to mitigate, how to address climate change. What is the takeaway that you would like to give us? Also, of course, thinking of the fact that we are preparing to go to COP at the end of the year, is that the place for us to address all kinds of solutions we have? Whom do we need to address any of our actions to? Maybe in real short, maybe a minute per person, starting with Teresa.
So a message to policymakers, is it, or to everyone? Well, maybe to the participants. Who? Either. Okay. Sorry. Maybe to the climate justice summer school people, I want to say, we know it's scary, when you think about the trajectory ahead, the temperature projections on current emission pathways, it's really scary. It's easy to get depressed, feel doom, and that the situation is helpless. But the only thing that is going to work at this stage is activism. And this is really a key time in history. We're lucky to be here at this key time in history in some ways, to amplify the call for real and radical solutions to the climate crisis, to call out the greenwash or the business as usual, to put the rights of impacted people at the center of the conversation on climate justice. Being an activist, being in a position to actually contribute to this fight is a privilege. So please make it count. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was good in time, and maybe indeed as well, we would like to know whether you have any reflection on the policy side of things, because of course they have to do the biggest work in our perspective. So what do we need them to be doing right now? And also hearing about everything that they're lacking on in this conversation.
Well, I think maybe my point would focus on COP, since we're moving into COP and sometimes we need to focus. Just to say that a global system to address climate change must help those who are most impacted, or it is simply not worthy of the name. Every single developing country at the last UN climate talks, that is 6 out of 7 people on the planet, have asked for COP27 to agree a new funding facility to address loss and damage. So that, and that's so that they can have the funds to recover, to rebuild, even to relocate in the aftermath of climate disasters or climate change impacts. So, it's really important for us as ActionAid that at COP27, rich countries, particularly the EU and the US, who are currently blocking, who've done the most to cause the climate crisis, yet experience the least impact, they stop blocking and they start taking responsibility. Let's remember that at the Glasgow COP, we really saw a huge shift from citizens, of rich countries actually calling on their leaders, and amplified by the media as well, demanding that governments step up and show solidarity on loss and damage. So if there's one thing I think we should be pushing on in the run up to COP, it would be that one, and all the other stuff. The climate justice, the real solution, that comes around that, but you have to put the rights of the people at the center or you don't get anything.
Thank you very much. Because I gave Teresa a little bit more time, Tasneem and Daniela have 30 seconds. But I would like to start with Tasneem. Please share with us maybe some recommendations and your reflections to take away from today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sophie. And so, just very quickly, I know I said I'm cynical, but I'm not. I am an eternal optimist. My optimism comes from the fact that I live in a country where we thought we would never win our freedom. We fought for that freedom and we did. Of course, there's challenges now, but, so recognizing that we have power as people. Every single one of the participants at this summer school should not despair, that they should recognize that they have power individually and collectively to bring about change. It might seem as if everything, seems so unattainable, but change happens through our power. And so I want to encourage all of the wonderful summer school participants to realize that you have power and then use that power to help bring about the changes that we have been speaking about in this engagement. So power to you, all of our wonderful activists in the summer school.
Thank you very much for your powerful message. Last but definitely not least, what should we do from the Netherlands perspective, from your perspective?
I think two things. We have to realize that the solutions are already out there, both at the financial sector, in agriculture, in adaptation. We know what we need to do. So let's get it done. That's first. So the people that question, can we do this? Yes, we can. And that's, first of all, we know what we need to do. And second of all, I myself have been at some of the COPs. I have been cynical about them for a long time because I just don't get it. It's too big, it's too many people, there's too many interests involved. And that's why I like to work more concretely in my own sphere of influence, which is the Netherlands in my case, wherever you are. And I think the COPs are a really good moment to raise awareness in the country, but we need to do that day by day by day. We cannot accept any longer that our bank invests in fossil fuels, that our pensions in fossil fuels, that our supermarkets are destroying the planet because they sell the wrong meat, whatever. So day-to-day activism on wherever you feel best to do so, because every person is different. It can be inside a company, it can be inside a government. There is no good way to do activism. As long as you challenge the powers that be together with others, you're doing a great job. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. I would like to reflect and come back and thank everyone for joining us today. That would be Danielle Hirsch, Tasneem Isop, and Teresa Anderson. Thank you all. I would also like to remind you that this was the second of the 3 climate talks that we have this summer. Make sure to register if you haven't for the third one as well, which will happen within 2 weeks. I think that's on the 10th of August, if I'm not mistaken. And that one will be about a very, very important topic, which was already addressed today, which will be very specifically about how are we going to finance everything that needs to be done to make sure that we address climate change. I would like to thank everyone for today, and hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Ja, maar dat doen we wel. Dat doe ik al. Dat is wel eventjes. Ik dacht dat het is wel wat. Nee, het gaat alleen over opnemen. Als we recorden opties hebben, die we recorden en de API, dan kunnen we echt wel de view aan. Dat kan. Dat we automatiseren.